The ayes have it. We move to clauses 1 and 2. Question is that clause... Are you seeking a call?
Yes, I am,
Well,
Mr Chair.
You must call.
Mr Chair.
Chris Farford.
Thank you very much for giving me a call on the title and commencement to the Companies and Limited Partnerships Amendment Bill. Mr Chair, this is usually the part of the debate where people have a bit of fun with the title of a bill. I won't do that and I will turn to the commencement, clause 2. And generally, as my colleague Claire Curran has pointed out, the commencement of this bill is going to become far too late. This is a bill, this is a government which claims it's business-friendly, works in the interests of both big and small, usually big business. But this piece of legislation, which is designed to protect the reputation of the legislation around companies and limited partnerships, has languished on the order paper under this government. I think it was the Minister Simon Bridges said it's because this government has been a busy government. Well, yes, in one respect, it's been a busy government selling our state-owned assets, introducing rank changes to our education system, and all of a sudden this piece of legislation lands in the House, and we haven't seen it for some time, and we have to ask the question around its commencement: why is it all of a sudden here? Why is this what we would call relatively mundane piece of legislation that has support from both sides of the House? Why is it all of a sudden arriving here in Parliament? And, Mr Chair, it's because, and to the people at home who don't understand what's going on here, it's because John Banks isn't here anymore. This government can't pass any of the legislation that it really wants to pass. That's really the bigger game here. That's what's going on. Because John Banks isn't here, you won't see anything that go through this House which the government can just squeak through with its one-vote majority. And that is the likes of selling our assets, changes to housing, changes to our education system. You won't see much of that anymore because this government no longer has the numbers to make sure that those kinds of pieces of legislation get through. For a long time now, this government has relied on the vote of John Banks and Peter Dunn to get all that kind of controversial legislation through, but no longer will we see that, Mr Chair, no longer will we see that because the vote of Mr Banks is no longer here. And that goes back to the commencement date, Mr Chair, and why I say this is coming in far too late. This is a piece of legislation which is very important and which has cross-party support. And as you've seen, there are a number of changes that the Minister has made in SOPs post the Select Committee process, which this side of the House is very, very happy to support. So you'd think that because of that relatively good working relationship on this side of the House, this piece of legislation would be shuffled through pretty quickly by this government, and we'd have this legislation there for the benefit of protecting the reputation of the legislation which governs companies. But no, the commencement date won't be for some time because this piece of legislation has sat on the order paper quite a way down, and its commencement date will be for some time into the future. And it could have been, Mr Chair, quite sadly, passed much, much sooner. And we wanted it to be passed much, much sooner, Mr Chair, again because of the protections it gives to our firms to protect the reputation that they have around the world. I have a number of small businesses in my electorate that trade, and I won't mention names because I won't enjoy that, but they go out there to the global market, and because they're from New Zealand, the people that they work with, Mr Chair, are quite happy to work with them because of the reputation that New Zealand businesses have. But as I said earlier, there has been a concern, both domestically and internationally, because, like a lot of other countries around the world, Mr Chair, there has been a fair degree of people using good reputations of firms of countries like New Zealand and taking advantage and using shell companies. So to protect the reputation of New Zealand firms, and I think quite rightly, and with the support of this side of the House, the Honourable Simon Power, in 2010 began work for this legislation to be improved. That's right. I did say 2010, so quite some time ago, and the National Party has had quite a high degree of support from this side of the House. But it is not till the 18th of June 2014 till we've got to the stage where this can get through the committee stages, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Chris Farfoy.
And I think that is a sad state of affairs, where the government doesn't think that this kind of legislation, which is very important for those more so for those smaller businesses who do use our reputation for doing business with those kinds of firms very strongly around the world, to ensure that they can get business. So they could have had a lot more confidence going out to going overseas and selling their products overseas, with more protection from this piece of legislation months or at the most years much earlier than what this government has given this piece of legislation priority. And I think that is a sad state of affairs in terms of when this piece of legislation will commence. As I say, Mr. Chair, it could have happened much sooner, only that this busy government was doing much more controversial things, and now it has got to the stage where, because of the mathematical realities of this House, non-controversial pieces of legislation will now be coming through the House. Mr. Chair, just to talk about some of the things that will commence under this bill, and I do want to talk about Section 131, where I understand it will be a criminal offence if a director breaches his or her duty under that section, where a director knows that a breach is seriously detrimental to the interests of the company, or breaches his or her duty under Section 135, where a director knows the breach will result in serious loss to the company's creditors. And I'm trying to think of a situation where that might be the case. And it certainly might be the way that ministers have carried out their dealings with the likes of, say, Solid Energy, because we certainly know that the direction given to that company had a detrimental effect to that company, and now it finds itself in a very tricky position trying to work itself out of a serious amount of debt because of the pressure that this government put under it. And it'll be interesting to see how this piece of legislation would lay out over that kind of situation, because in that situation, the directors of that company were put under a fair amount of pressure to increase their gearing to make sure that the government could get a better return from what was a well-performing SOE, but is now one that is struggling to quite an extreme extent and had to force many layoffs. And that is the kind of management of our SOEs that we've had from this type of government. So in terms of the title and commencement, Mr. Chair, on this side of the House, it has happened far too late. We've made requests to the Minister as to why this piece of legislation, which deals with criminality in a corporate sense, wasn't given the same priority from a government in terms of the other legislation that deals with criminality at a street level. And again, we think there's a degree of dog whistle going over there from a government that said it was business friendly, but really, in this sense, hasn't walked the talk and hasn't given those smaller companies the protection of the reputation of doing trade in New Zealand. And I think our businesses may have suffered to a degree because of that. They haven't given what it calls their natural supporters the protection of this legislation, which could have happened much, much earlier. So I do, again, offer the Minister and the Chair, in the dying stages of this committee stage, the opportunity to explain the government's position on that. Again, Mr. Chair, not so hopeful of a response.
Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to go back to the New Zealand being removed from the whitelist issue in just this